Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this afternoon's event. My name is Dave Moxham. I'm Deputy General Secretary at the STUC. You're all most welcome. This event is being recorded, just for your information. We look forward today to the presentation of two reports, discussion afterwards, all within the next hour. So my introductory comments will be relatively short. We have an audience from Scotland, the UK, and internationally, so I will take a couple of moments just to give an introduction to the Just Transition Partnership, which is sponsoring this event. That is a coalition between Scottish trade unions and Scottish campaign groups with a focus on climate. It's an organisation which has been in existence for around a decade and is built upon the shared view that if we are to tackle climate change with speed and justice, then delivering both economic justice and climate change together based on a shared perspective is the best way to do that. So our coalition argues quite clearly that requires workers' voice and empowerment through trade unionisation, that it requires government intervention and public policy, which is good, and that includes public ownership, and it argues for industrial strategies and social policies across the whole of Scotland, which ensure that justice is delivered for our communities alongside our workers. And today's event, unfortunately, will show that many of those strategies are failing. We believe that our prospectus over the last 10 years, and certainly all the way up to the COP, which was famously held in Glasgow a couple of years ago, did have significant influence over government. Unfortunately, what was said and what has been done is not the same, and there's been significant failures of public policy. Arguably, over the last year or two, we've seen a pulling back, if anything, from climate justice targets. And we've also seen trends towards the aim of attracting private investment without conditionality over the public and social investment that we advocate. On a daily basis, I engage with industries across the sector who tell us that they are in a blind panic about skills and personnel shortage. Yet in Scotland, as in many other places in the world, we still continue to see week on week, month on month job losses in offshore oil and gas, without transition policies to support them. And of course, very pertinently to Scotland, the crisis that we're currently seeing at Grangemouth, which will be the focus of our discussion. So that's a little bit of the framing of where we sit. We have two presentations coming up to you. I'd encourage you, if you have any questions or points you wish to raise, to use the chat if you wish, and that will be monitored throughout the event. But there'll also be the opportunity afterwards, after the two speakers, to indicate if you have any specific questions or contributions to make. So I'm now going to turn to our first presentation. Ewan Gibbs will be our first presenter. He is a historian of energy industry work, and I'm glad to say protest. His work focuses on production and consumption of energy and how that has pivotally shaped employment, politics, and economic change. He's the author of Coal Country, The Meaning and Memory of Deindustrialisation in Post-War Scotland, and most pertinently for today's discussion, then, along with Ryoko Shibe, has authored the report, The Grangemouth Refinery Closure Workers' Perspectives, and that's a piece of work that was undertaken for our Just Transition Commission, which in turn, we would argue, was a creation of our Just Transition Partnership. Ryan is a regular commentator and a key ally for us in terms of the arguments we wish to put forward, and you're very welcome. Sorry, Ryan, Ewan, you're very welcome to present to us today.
Thanks very much. Can I just confirm everybody can see this okay? Great. So today I'm presenting findings from a new report was kindly published by the Just Transition Partnership, Workers' Perspectives on Energy Transitions in Britain. It's a report that reflects on 60 to 70 years of history of vibrant change in Britain's energy economy and thinks about how those changes were navigated, endured, but also formed bases of prosperity and positive changes for workers. So the key findings of the report, which I'll unpack in some more detail in the next few minutes, are firstly that workers have moved between energy sectors before. I think there's something of a tendency in our current discussion to treat the impending or ongoing rundown of employment in carbon intensive sectors, especially in North Sea oil and gas, is relatively historically unprecedented. And I think we actually need to be careful about that. In a British context, arguably over a period now approaching something like a human lifetime, we've been through several experiences where older energy sectors have contracted and new ones have grown. Energy transitions in the past were experienced as opportunities as well as threats. When they were relatively well organised, occasions when workforces and communities actually had their economic security reinforced on the basis of creating new employment opportunities. Sometimes that was based on either occupational mobility, movement between sectors of the economy, and on other occasions, geographical mobility. And I have recorded instances where workers moved between parts of the country in order to pursue new opportunities. These experiences were made far more positive and were seen as safer options where trade unions provided collective voice for workers, where important changes to the energy economy were planned and negotiated in advance. And that brings out the key role of government policy making. Firstly, through the form of publicly owned energy sectors, but also at the larger level of economic policy making and the role of government in coordinating transitions between sectors of the economy, movements of workers out of one sector and into another, and balancing interests between different parts of the country. And importantly, making these decisions often well in advance. How did I do this? What's in the report? It's based on a British Academy Wilson Fellowship project, which I've undertaken over the last three years or so since early 2022. So a funded research project that case studied relevant industries in parts of Britain since the 1940s and 1950s. You'll see in the report then references to key energy sectors, examples from coal mining, electricity generation, the nuclear sector, oil and gas, and also the contemporary developments in renewables. This is based on the one hand in research in relevant archives, the records of industry, including publicly owned industry, the UK government, including relevant Scottish departments as well, and the Scottish government, and also records, of course, of the trade union movement. But alongside this is also based on reflections that I recorded with the people who lived through these transformations. Oral history interviews with former and current workers from these relevant energy sectors, from current and former trade union officials, industry managers, as well as politicians and civil servants. I think these were important opportunities on the one hand to provide details about what these experiences felt like for workers and their families at the time, but also to use the current vantage to reflect on positive experiences from the past, as well as to ensure that we don't repeat some of the mistakes that were made in the past in terms of managing our own current ongoing pivotal energy transition. This is what the report looks like. when you download it right after this meeting finishes this afternoon and avidly spend the rest of your day reading it. It provides an overview of the history of British energy transitions before jumping into a series of case studies that include the expansion of the electricity and nuclear industry in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, the development of oil rig manufacturing related to the North Sea industry in the 1970s and 1980s, and a study of the current difficulties facing the development of a wind turbine construction sector in Scotland and Britain in the 21st century. I end with some overall recommendations that I'll come to towards the end of this presentation. I think, firstly, it's very, very important when we're reflecting on these transitions to actually highlight the biggest case in terms of lost jobs, which is the coal mining industry. And we tend to think about those lost jobs in relation to the disastrous pit closures of the 1980s and 1990s after the miners' defeat in the 1984-5 strike. But actually, the biggest set of job losses in the coal industry in the period I'm looking at really took place in the 1960s. In the late 50s, there were around 700,000 miners in Britain, and by the early 70s, there were less than 300,000. This slide has a picture that contains some evidence of that. It's from the Meadies in West Fife, a great public resource, a great green space, which is built atop the re-landscape former coalfield of West Fife. And we see the evidence of that in the wooden frame of the Mary Colliery, which shut in 1966. These experiences of job losses, though, are remembered in comparatively positive terms. They involved the direction of investment in manufacturing industries to declining coalfields. Mining jobs where they remained became safer, cleaner, and relatively better paid, but also miners' wives, their sons, and their daughters often found jobs in better paid, safer, and cleaner industrial opportunities. That included the expansion of the electricity industry, one of the few areas that was still using coal in increasing quantities in Britain in the 1960s and 1970s. And in the report, there's several examples of what that industry meant, including quotes from two miners' sons, Ken Rochester, whose family relocated from Northumberland to the English Midlands so that his father could take up an opportunity at Lea Hall Colliery, which was constructed to supply the new Rudsley power station in Staffordshire, where Ken himself found work. He described living in a new prosperous town in Stafford, where manufacturing job opportunities were extended to women, including his aunties and his mother. And he found jobs in what his father regarded as a safer, better occupation than he had in power generation rather than in coal mining. Similarly, Richard Bottrell, who also lived in the English Midlands, found work in Drakelow Power Station in the 1970s. He'd actually lost a job in an apprenticeship opportunity in contracting manufacturing industry nearby, but he regarded the nationalised electricity industry as a centre of learning and social advancement, as well as an important site of opportunities for trade union activity. He described entering the industry with very few, if any, formal qualifications from school, but leaving it in the 1990s after privatisation, having obtained an engineering degree. There were parallel stories that I recorded from the nuclear industry, which particularly related to struggling, contracting resource economies of England and Wales. So in West Cumbria, which is the centre of the UK's nuclear employment at the Sellafield site, another miner's son, Roger Denwood, who's now a trade union convener at Sellafield, described the region as having gone through a natural progression towards nuclear jobs out of the contracting coal mining and iron mining and founding sectors, whereas his family had traditionally worked. So there's a story of successive generations often being employed in these sectors. And this was relayed to me by Rory Trapp, who is an engineer at the Trawsfynydd site in North Wales, a now decommissioning nuclear power station. Rory described how his family, who had ties to the construction trade, arrived in the area in the 1960s to be involved in building the site, but that he himself found a job there and became a craft worker in the 1970s. And I think these stories about family and community connections and their persistence across generations are important. The picture on this slide is from a housing scheme that was built for workers in Gwynedd for the Trawsfynydd power station. And this was an era when otherwise the area was struggling. The leather tanning industry and the slate quarrying sector were in contraction, and nuclear workers were keen to underline that this brought a new layer of work and prosperity to an area which was also a traditional and still is an important centre of Welsh speaking in the country. Around the same time, or perhaps a decade after, the North Sea oil discovery is I think quite well remembered as an important instance of industrial and economic change, especially in northern Scotland. And I know there's colleagues from Shetland on this call. In my research, I've highlighted the onshore activities that were part of that transformation, particularly hopes attached to new manufacturing activities in oil rig manufacturing. At its height, it's estimated that North Sea fabrication work may have employed more than 20,000 workers. They were concentrated in northern Scotland, in new yards in the Highlands, and actually in the Western Isles and Lewis as well, but also within the traditional shipbuilding centres of Clydeside and Tyneside in the northeast of England as well. The new yards in the Highlands, and in my research, I look at the Highland Fabricators Yard on the Cromarty Firth in Nig, provided important opportunities for local workers, both local tradesmen, but also women workers who were trained as welders at a new welding school that was open, and white collar as well as manual jobs. There were significant wage inducements on offer at these yards. I recorded tradesmen who spoke about tripling or doubling their earnings overnight in the 1970s, and certainly over several years, obtaining far higher earnings than they've been able to in the local economy before. And these inducements attracted travelling men. For instance, shipbuilders left yards in Dundee that were closing to take up opportunities in the Cromarty Firth and at these other yards. There's a quote here from Craig Mackay, who's a welder from Brora, who began an apprenticeship as a teenager in the late 1970s. And he talked about, in his interview, the value and confidence that work at HiFab gave him, that ultimately he learned to become a qualified welder, was involved in large-scale projects, finished what he regarded as high-quality work at Nig, but also this gave him an opportunity, a springboard to enter work in the global oil industry. And he's since worked in oil fields as far apart as the west coast of Africa and in North America and the Gulf of Mexico as well. These achievements in fabrication were shaped by government policy. The Labour government in the 1970s set up an offshore supplies office, which played an important role in securing work for these yards. In fact, the STUC in 1983 described the OSO as having played a major role in winning and increasing the share of orders for the UK continental shelf for British yards and suppliers. There's a story here, I think, of government intervention being successful, even when it takes the form of informal pressure being placed on oil companies when it came to developing rigs and manufacturing opportunities in the North Sea. Notably, management at the yards, in interviews I recorded with a retired manager, he agreed with this assessment from the unions and actually highlighted the abandonment of these policies, particularly under pressure from EU liberalisation in the 1990s, as partly being behind the ultimate closure and failure of much of the sector later in the 20th century and into the 2000s. Our current context, it's been wind turbines, which have been central, particularly in Scotland, but also across the UK, to hopes for employment, which have not matched the massive increase in renewables electricity generation that we've lived through. I do want to highlight though that I recorded interviews with workers who did and were living through important prosperous changes in their working lives. I think Archie McClellan, who's a rope access worker, is actually on the call just now. So hi Archie, I said I'd quote you today. In 2023, Archie, who formerly worked offshore and was a second generation offshore worker originally from the northeast of Scotland, described working maintaining wind turbines as being employed in a cleaner, nicer, different, and I think more technologically sophisticated industry than the one he'd worked in before in the offshore oil and gas sector. But I also recorded references to other workers, including office workers and laboratory workers finding work in renewables and leaving oil and gas behind, or having been made unemployed, given the context of large-scale contraction. On the other hand, though, replicating those transformations on a large scale has proved persistently difficult in the UK. The political and economic dynamics that led to the contraction of oil rig manufacturing have continued in wind turbine manufacturing. The sector is dominated by large multinationals and international supply chains. I would argue there's also been insufficient pressure from UK and Scottish governments to use the advantages that we have in the sense of the exploitation of our resources to pressure and mould an opportunity for Scottish and British industrial workers. Happy to discuss this further in the questions, but I appreciate I'm running out of time here. The one case I want to highlight at the top here is from the so-called battle for BIFAB in 2017, when unionised workers occupied two of the three BIFAB yards in Fife. Ultimately, that helped keep those yards open. But they've been through three different ownership changes. There's been four different owners of those yards since 2017 now, and they're currently the two remaining yards in Fife and on Lewis, respectively, are owned by the Spanish state-owned shipbuilding company Navantina. Now, hopefully, that does provide a basis for a securer future for work and investment in renewables for those workforces and for those localities. I want to conclude by underlining that, in my experience, both in a historical context and a contemporary one, workers are ready, willing, and even expect to be part of a transition. And that's no more apparent than at Grangemouth, where the refinery workers that Rio Koshibi and I spoke to for our report in 2024 were angry that they weren't going to be using their skills in green manufacturing at Grangemouth. We see also that skills that have a history in carbon sectors are useful and even essential in greener energy generation and manufacturing. We also have a valuable history of successfully taking opportunities in the context of energy transition and sectoral changes in Scotland and the UK that we should be learning from. Where workers and their unions have been allowed to exercise their voice and negotiate these processes, they've been more prosperous for the workforce, for their families and communities, and also for the national economy as a whole. But achieving those positive outcomes also relies on the role of government in being willing to organise and plan change with industry, with workers, with communities, and to plan those changes far in advance. These are long-term shifts. We should be talking in terms of 5 to 10 year shifts, not suddenly reacting to current market conditions or the decisions of employers to close workplaces unexpectedly. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much indeed, Ewan. An excellent presentation, and I think one which is particularly valuable in the sense that it highlights that there are positive examples, positive historical examples, as well as negative examples, and that offers us pathways. We can learn from failures, obviously, but we can learn from positive interventions as well. We had in the chat there something from Yanis in Greece, who said that, and I've noticed it a few times over the last few years, Scotland is being quoted as a positive example of just transition, which is, I think, both a recognition that we are at least in the policy debate and we have the right people having that discussion, but can sometimes be a slight frustration for us in Scotland, because we also know that having provided the evidence and provided the evidence of the pathways, public policy is currently failing to meet that potential. And your your report and your general body of work absolutely reinforces that for us and points us in the right direction. I'm now going to move on to my colleague, Ryan Morrison, who is a member of the STUC's Just Transition team. I spoke to Ryan briefly about how much time I should spend introducing him, and he said that will be enough. I'd rather use the time to present our work. And I think, Ryan, this is drawn from a number of pieces of work that the STUC has done in conjunction with our affiliates and a range of researchers. Looks particularly into the offshore wind sector and the wind sector generally, which has been, as Ewan said, presented as anywhere between a panacea and a disaster, and probably it sits somewhere in between, but we'll find out from Ryan where current STUC trade union thinking is on development and success or otherwise in that sector. So over to you, Ryan.
Yeah, thank you, Dave. I'm probably going to come to some of that discussion about Scotland's performance in Just Transition quite quickly before moving into thinking more about some of our work on offshore wind. But yeah, worth saying that work for the STUC on our Just Transition projects, quite a long-standing interest that trade union movement in Scotland has had in Just Transition, recognising a lot of the opportunities as well as a lot of the risks for workers and working class communities as we look to move towards net zero, delivering on climate targets, but also with new opportunities emerging from Scotland's vast renewable resource. And I think just on that point, what's important in terms of the initial positivity that there might have been from Scotland, some of the things that some of you may have picked up in terms of the performance that we've seen from the Scottish Government, just a quick couple of sections on what has happened. This will be the type of information, the type of initiatives you'll have seen. 2019, the Just Transition Commission, an independent advisory body, was established by the Scottish Government. We had Just Transition principles, which included things like job protection and accounting for the impact on communities of investment and loss of investment, included in our Climate Change Act. Then in 2021, we had a new National Just Transition Planning Framework established alongside a commitment that the Scottish Government made to develop just transition plans for all sectors and all regions. And in addition to that, there was a £500 million over 10-year fund announced for the North East and Moray, one of the regions of Scotland that's most likely to be hit particularly hard in the transition, particularly because of the density of employment in oil and gas there. And I've included these pictures not for any reason other than that the context is important, right? The COP26 was in Glasgow around this time. We had Scottish Government being formed through a sort of coalition deal between the SNP and the Scottish Green Party at the time. And I think that's sort of reflective in the tone of some of these initiatives and where they came from, as well as a lot of the work that the partnership, the STUC and allies had been working on together and calling for some of the frameworks to be put in place quite quickly. But unfortunately, as has been mentioned in the chat, the actual outcome of this, particularly in recent years, has been kind of unfurling around us, quite shaky foundations. You'll see snippets here from different aspects of that, whether or not that was Just Transition Fund money being cut, budgets being taken from ScotWind revenues, and I'll come on to ScotWind shortly, the situation at Grangemouth and the powerlessness that's reported by workers, the vote to scrap climate change targets as well, alongside then the lack of jobs opportunity in offshore wind. And a quick quote here from the Just Transition Commission. I think we've got a couple of commissioners on the call from their 2023 annual report. It just said the current path will not deliver a just transition, and the use of a just transition as a fix-all term without specific policies and actions to actually realise it must be avoided from now on. And that was quite a direct criticism, which reflects that the Scottish Government had been using it as a fix-all term without much concrete action beside it. And I'm going to focus on offshore wind now, and I think it's a good frame for us to compare with what Ewan's research shows in that dynamic of how do you manage industrial transition well? How do you get these sorts of transition right? And the reason I'm going to focus on offshore wind is because that was a real opportunity for the Scottish Government to take some of those foundations, to take some of those principles and operationalise them to make them tangible, which unfortunately hasn't played out. And we've done a lot of research into that, into thinking about why that hasn't happened and what needs to change, which sits alongside Ewan's report and the lessons learned there. And I think it's worth going into just where we were in 2022. So our initial bit of research here looks at jobs and employment, and what you see is that within Scotland's low carbon and renewable energy economy, offshore wind and onshore wind have increasingly come to dominate the economic activity. So whether or not that's the turnover that companies are reporting, whether or not it's the volume of exports, the volume of imports, you see quite clearly that offshore and onshore wind make up minimum 60%, except for employment, where it falls dramatically to less than a quarter. And really what that means is companies are increasingly reporting higher turnovers within the offshore and onshore wind sector, while creating fewer and fewer jobs in return. And that falls down to quite a dramatic low that you see in the graph in the bottom left there, where you get less than one job in offshore and onshore wind per £1 million of turnover from companies involved in the sector, relative to moving back to 2018, when you might have seen 6 jobs in offshore wind, or slightly above 1 onshore wind. Hasn't changed very much in that time. And all of this going on at the same time as we're talking about just transition as well. And Scotland then became this massive opportunity in Scotland, where the Scottish Government was given control through Crown Estate Scotland, a public sort of quango, a sort of publicly owned body. Scottish Government could set the terms of that leasing process, and actually what played out there instead, it's one of the biggest leasing rounds for offshore wind in the world anywhere, a potential 30 gigawatts of offshore wind energy available, where what you see here is the 20 wind farms located mainly around the east coast, some coming off the far north and even into the west coast as well. And what we've done through our research is really looked at, well, who won those bids? Who has taken ownership of those projects? And it's a real mixture, but the consistent theme is that they are large private companies. They are sometimes asset managers or investment firms who don't really have staff in any real traditional sense that you might expect. They're not necessarily energy companies in the way you might recognise, but also then some publicly owned companies of overseas countries. Some you'll recognise, you know, you've got Scottish Power in there, you've got Total, BP, Vattenfall, but others that will be unfamiliar to most people on the call. Copenhagen Infrastructure Partners, for instance, Magnora. Again, some of these are bodies which move cash left and right, project to project, with no intention of ever actually managing the project themselves. They'll subcontract the work out to others. And that final column at the end just shows the committed level of investment into Scotland. So all of these projects have been asked to submit supply chain statements where they say how much investment in percentage terms will come to Scotland, the rest of the UK, the rest of Europe, and the rest of the world. And what you see along that column is just how much each project has committed into Scotland through that. And you can see some very low numbers there, 15% for the Stewart project, 16% from Project Morven, 13% in Muir. Some of those numbers are very low, up to some relatively higher numbers, 63% for the Buckenfield, 64% Narvin South, but a real mixture, and very little oversight of that as well in terms of what the Scottish Government was demanding through the process. So taking our analysis further, we've heard some quite negative experiences of workers in the renewable sector, particularly within offshore wind. So as part of our work, as part of some of our research, we sent a survey to all of those developers that you've just seen on that list, asking if they'd commit to principles of fair work that we think should be fairly well established, that we think the Scottish Government should have set as a condition of the licensing round, including some basic questions. Are you open to trade union recognition? Will all workers be paid at least the real living wage? Will you ensure there's no use of 0 hours or casual contracts? And unfortunately, we received no full responses to that survey from any of those developers. It wasn't something the Scottish Government asked these companies to commit to, so we thought we'd ask for them. Unfortunately, not a single company or developer decided to provide us with a full reply. And interestingly, one of those companies actually replied to say that they couldn't possibly fill it out because there are only 3 members of staff in the team. Which is again is revealing in terms of the scale of projects they've taken on, the scale of investment that's coming up. Ultimately, that company isn't going to do that work itself. It's moving money around, as I said. And another interesting aspect of it is something we've called for a long time, is public ownership within the energy sector in order to maximise the benefits for people in Scotland as far as possible. And it's interesting to compare the companies involved in the Scotland leasing round that are publicly owned, and you see some very large, again, recognisable companies like Vattenfall, also EnBW, ESB, Asperavi, Ørsted, ENGI, which again represent different types of companies and public ownership. I think something that's really fascinating about this is you get someone like Asperavi, which is a sort of collective municipal company from 94 Belgian cities and municipalities owning projects within the offshore wind sector in Scotland. And again, this is just to draw out really the distinctions that we're seeing in terms of the process with offshore wind in Scotland and how it's been developed. And I guess the purpose of sharing some of this, and I'm just going to stop sharing the slide that I kind of wrap up what I wanted to say is, Ewan's research is really valuable to us because we hear often in the conversation about just transition that we need to not make the mistakes that we made when it came to coal miners and how coal communities were treated. And actually what we know now from Ewan's research is that there are positive examples. Britain in the past, in the relatively recent past, has successfully managed industrial transitions and successfully made major changes to the way its energy and industry worked. And it's done so in a way that supported workers through that process, it supported communities through that process. And there's some key lessons there for us, which when you then compare to how the Scottish Government, having established all of this framework around just transition, has sort of overlooked and not really brought to the table. You don't see the level of public coordination to make sure that these things are delivered. As one of the newspaper clippings pointed out, we're 2 years delayed on an energy strategy. All the other just transition plans are years delayed. You're not seeing that level of public control and public delivery. You don't see worker voice. We're asking for trade union recognition. We're taking that to these companies and we're being resisted. We're asking the Scottish Government to leverage that against them through the leasing process, and we're not seeing that happen. It's denying opportunities for trade union, and these are complicated projects that can be difficult to organise within. And there are major risks to this for us, which is that particularly now when you see the situation at Grangemouth, you also see the situation facing people working in offshore oil and gas. There are job losses happening in quite incredible numbers at the minute. But also the Grangemouth situation, as I said, you see communities losing out in this, and you see energy bills rising. It's a pretty toxic recipe now that not only is undermining faith in political commitments to just transition, but has the potential to risk broader pushback as we see the rise of the far right and concerns about net zero more broadly, that until we can start to tangibly show that what was an opportunity at one point can actually become a meaningful benefit, meaningful jobs, meaningful investment, meaningful community security, actually will continue to be facing pushback and resistance. And Ewan's research has been invaluable for us and able to show that it's very possible. And in recent times, it's been done here already. So I'll wrap up there and move us into the Q&A.
Thanks very much indeed, Ryan. And I think that your presentation demonstrates, I guess, that past failures and ongoing failures doesn't mean that we're not actively still engaged in campaigning around this. And you identify obviously both the importance of the geography of ownership, the nature of ownership, but also, as again someone's mentioned in the chat, the importance, even when we are talking about the private sector, for the use of proper conditionalities and the identification of levers. And there's been a failure of the use of levers as much as there's been a failure of overall strategy and ownership.